This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're going to talk all about labor and the labor shortage that has been touted in America during this almost post-COVID period. We have three interesting panelists with us today to talk about it from different perspectives. We have Robyn Domber, who is Vice President of Research at Development Counselors International. She joined DCI in 2011 after more than 13 years of working in the economic development and site selection consulting field. Michael Bernick practices law in the area of employment and labor law. He advises employers on issues related to employer taxes, unemployment insurance, disability insurance. He was previously director of California's Employment Development Department, the EDD, the 10,000-person state Department of Labor. And finally, Lane Windham. Lane is Associate Director of Georgetown University's Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor, and co-director of the Will Empower Women Innovating Labor Leadership. She's author of Knocking on Labor's Door, Union Organizing in the 1970s, and the Roots of the New Economic Divide, and she works very closely with our longtime friend, John Russo. Panelists, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, look, I'm thrilled that we can deal with this issue now, and hopefully there'll be areas of agreement and disagreement. But let's just start off right now. There's a huge amount of talk, and you hear it from business people all the time, can't get talent. And that goes everywhere from the highest end to, who's going to work in the restaurant. Is this a temporary phenomena, or is this something we're going to be dealing with in the next decade? Anyone want to start with that?
So Joel, I can jump in.
Sure.
So I do think that there were a number of factors that came into play as a result of COVID that sort of forced people out of the workforce in terms of, childcare issues, just economic instability, other things. But in the long run, there is this demographic drought that's happening. We just know that due to demographics, that there are not going to be as many people entering the workforce. We're going to have more people exiting the workforce. And that's putting communities and employers in a really tough position, trying to figure out not only these short-term solutions to address some of those things that did arise out of COVID, but also just these longer demographic trends.
Lane or Michael, you have something to add to this?
Sure, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I agree with Robyn that there were a lot of shifts, obviously, that happened during COVID. I think what we're seeing here now, though, is this a labor shortage or is this a wage shortage?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It depends on your point of view. And we have had in this country a model, a low wage, low benefit model for 40 years. And employers have been making employment and business models based on that low wage model. And I think that though this particular crisis and this sort of monthly employment numbers may change, I think what we are seeing is a long-term shift away from what's been happening for 40 years. where workers have had no choice but to take these low wage, no benefit jobs with little security, and in which women were doing lots and lots of unpaid care in the home and holding full-time paid work. I think we're seeing a paradigm shift coming out of the coronavirus, and I'm excited to talk about that today.
Michael?
Well, I think those are Robyn and Lane have made good points. I would say two things, Joel, here in California. One, we do have a case where employers, for the first time I've seen, and I go back almost as far as you, Joel. I go back to I started in the job field in a community job training group in 1979. So that we've had 5 recessions since that in California, and this recovery is very, very different. But because workers aren't coming back, and it's really 4 factors here in California. There's the as Robyn mentioned, there's the schools closing and childcare. There's lingering concern about health, real and imagined. But there's also, and there's the unemployment supplement. Things will change in September. Whether we have a paradigm shift, I think, is going to be a key question today, Joel. But things I think will begin to change in September when the schools hopefully reopen, childcare hopefully becomes more available, the $300 per week supplement ends, and I think we will see people coming back. But I do think that what Lane mentioned is a phenomenon. For the first time I've seen in 5 recoveries since 1980, people are reconsidering at all levels. I think the pandemic created a shock to the system so that people are saying, do I want to go back to what I was doing before?
Well, and let me follow up on that, because isn't that really at the end of the day a cultural issue? Are we seeing, with the shift demographically toward a younger workforce, are we seeing a shift toward, look, I want a different calculus between my work life and my personal life. The pandemic gave me a little hint about how flexible I can be in terms of getting my work done. And now, what do I need to be subject to all of these strictures and this structure? Is that happening?
Yeah, Marshall, let me just jump in on that. And Joel, you probably remember, every single recession since 1980, every recovery, Marshall, people have said, commentators have come out and said, oh, the labor market will never be the same, society will never be the same. And then within a short time, things go back to the way they were. The labor market has remained remarkably stable. So I think we want to be a little bit careful, but I think it's also true that there's something going on now that we haven't seen before.
Michael, I would agree with that, but it's interesting to note that we've been doing a research series since 2017 called Talent Wars, where we've been surveying working age residents across the United States on how they make relocation decisions. And our presumption going in was that it's quality of life is huge. That's how people choose where they're going to relocate to, and work-life balance. And what we have consistently found since 2017 is it's all about the job. People want to be assured, if they are going to relocate, that they are having a comparable, if not better, standard of living. And that revolves a lot around, salary, benefits, affordable housing. Those are the issues that we have seen since 2017 that have consistently risen to the top in terms of the most important factors in relocation decisions. So I think there's this very romanticized notion in terms of, people are going to completely rethink how they do work. But at the end of the day, they want to make sure that their standard of living is still something that they can, stand behind.
Well, and Lane, jump in here, would you? Because this is an opportunity to talk about the changing nature of kind of a buyer's market versus a seller's market of labor. It seems to me it's the first time in a long time that labor actually has the potential of making an inroad.
Particularly as well as on the lower end, not just the higher end, which I think is what Robyn was referring to.
Yeah, so, going back to your question, Marshall, about whether there's a cultural change, it is partly about culture, but it's also about structure and policy. We have a structure and policy in this country where, for instance, restaurant workers are paid a sub-minimum wage of $2.13 an hour. $2.13 an hour, right? Plus tips. What that means is that is a policy that impacts restaurant workers, most of whom are women and people of color. The group One Fair Wage recently did a survey of restaurant workers who are out of work with the pandemic. 78%, 8 out of 10 workers said that the thing that would make them come back to work is a higher wage, right? That's what they need. And, we have consistently had policy which propped up the restaurant industry at the expense of women and people of color in this country. Is that a decision that we're going to continue to make? I don't see that so much as cultural as I see that as a way in which patriarchy and racism is baked into the structures that we have underscoring our entire employment system.
And you would have to admit that white male servers are in the same situation.
They are, but if you look at the statistics in restaurant work, white males servers consistently make more than women who tend to have, the diner, the waitress jobs, right, the lower wage jobs.
Well, I think there is a differential between different segments of the labor market, and obviously all of us, have that concern. Joel, you write about it regularly concerning the growth of low-wage jobs and the presence of low-wage jobs, and then the obvious question becomes what can be done, and that's where I think people, there's the disagreement that we have. I think everyone acknowledges one of the positive things about the post-pandemic economy so far is driving up wages to an extent, not to a great enough extent to make a significant difference, but it's driving up wages. That's positive in low-wage jobs. So I think that the challenge for all of us is what more can be done to expand, to build up these jobs and build up the middle class. I think we all agree that that's a key issue.
And I do think that wages, we are starting to see essentially what I see when you have, nearly 9 million jobs open in this country, and so many workers who are saying that, they won't go back without a higher wage. I see that in a way as a very sort of slow moving general strike in this country. And it's having an effect, kind of. Michael, you might have the latest statistics, but nationally, average hourly wages rose 20 cents an hour in April, another 13 cents in May, 10 cents in June, right? So that's a 43-cent basically wage increase over 3 months. Meanwhile, the minimum wage, of course, in this country has been stuck at $7.25 since 2009 for 12 years. So workers essentially in this kind of slow-moving, undeclared general strike are having an impact in terms of moving the needle on wages.
Well, we're also seeing a migration of people to lower cost of living areas, recognizing that, even a 40-cent an hour increase in wages is not enough to make a living in a high cost area. What are you seeing, Robyn, in terms of employers rethinking their location strategies to accommodate movements of people to lower cost areas?
It's a great question, and it's so sort of multifaceted because, as we know, the remote workforce has opened up so much in terms of employers, and they have so much greater access to employers basically from all over, or employees from all over the world. So the location decisions that we are seeing is, yes, talent still is the dominant factor. There absolutely has to be a workforce in order for employers to consider an area for relocation or expansion. One thing we are seeing, though, particularly among more consumer-facing public companies, is that as a result of some of the diversity and inclusivity issues that have come up over the past year, is in order to attract talent, the company is just part of it. The community also has to be seen as welcoming to diverse talent. And so that has become increasingly more important in terms of the communities, how they're coming together to look at their short list of communities. They want to make sure that when they are trying to attract and recruit employees, that they're not only comfortable at the company, but in the community itself as well. So I honestly feel that that's had a huge impact, again, particularly among a certain segment of companies.
You know, Lane, you said something that really intrigued me there about the notion of a de facto general strike.
Yeah.
And as I was thinking about it, I was thinking, you know, if this is a general strike, it's a general strike that has disintermediated the union. That people are striking and taking personal responsibility for withholding their labor, and in essence, negotiating with management on a non-collective way. Are you looking at it that way, or is it likely to be less successful because it's not part of an organized union and collective bargaining movement?
Right.
What's your sense?
Well, I mean, you know, workers, there have been a number of general strikes like this over the years, you know. Of course, the massive movement of enslaved people away from the plantations after the Civil War was seen by many people as a general strike, right? So there have been other kinds of disaggregated general strikes, but the question that you ask, I think, gets to, hey, what's happening with organized labor in this country? If workers are having this experience, why aren't the union numbers rising through the roof? Why aren't people forming unions left and right? And that really gets to the fact that we have broken labor law in this country. The labor law in this country is basically is so weak. There are no penalties when employers break the law. Employers routinely violate workers' rights, fire workers, threaten them when they try to form unions. And so really what's happened in this country is that workers no longer have a full right to form a union. And in fact, Human Rights Watch determined that in 2000, that in this country, working people do not have an adequate right to collective bargaining, freedom of association, and forming unions. And so why aren't people forming unions left and right? It's because it's incredibly difficult in this country. And again, I think this comes back to this question of policy and law, and the system that we have undergirding workers in this country.
I'd like to just add a little bit to that, which is it's not just that it's difficult to organize, and obviously there's a big debate there, but like I was specifically thinking, Michael, maybe you could deal with this a little bit. What do you do with industries like technology, where there's been essentially no unionization for 50 years now, 40, 50 years? Is that going to change? I mean, you monitor what's going on in Silicon Valley. That's still kind of the leading element of the American economy. I assume these wage pressures are there as well. Is there any chance that there'll be some general striking in Silicon Valley?
Well, Joel, there's always a lot of activity going on here in Silicon Valley. Labor unions are very active trying to, whether it's the Uber workers or Uber drivers or Amazon. I mean, there's a great deal of activity all the time. It just hasn't yielded, results, and for some of the reasons Lane mentioned. I do think there are two other dynamics, though, Joel. One is how much this sort of general strike continues after September. Right now in California, if you're in a job that pays less than $29,000 or $30,000 a year, you're doing better on unemployment insurance. Now, the positive is it gives people a chance to reconsider it. It hopefully, again, continues to drive up wages even more than Lane mentioned. But how much that's going to continue after, this additional supplement ends in September, how much the reluctance for anyone who's, at least for those workers earning under $30,000 a year, I think is still up in the air. I think we will see some changes. But again, I come back to, we all sort of agree what we need, these lower wage jobs, to me, that's the central issue in the labor market and has been for the last decade or two. But how much, the current post-pandemic after September will significantly change that, I think remains to be seen.
Well,
Robyn,
and let's look at this notion of the longer term. So I'm aware of a lot of initiatives in the AI and automated robotics space that management teams are engaged in to try to get low-end labor out of the picture. So, there was just an article this past week about Flippy, the automated hamburger and French fry maker that's being tested in fast food stores right now. And so my question is, if we're moving into a world that is going to be characterized by AI, by algorithms making decisions rather than people, by robots replacing low-end labor, is this just kind of a lot of temporary noise that really, obfuscates the bigger question of what are we going to do with all our people 10 years from now?
That should stimulate something.
Hello.
So this may not directly answer your question, but some good news that came out of our research was when we asked working age individuals whether they would be willing to undergo additional training to increase their career opportunities. 80% said yes. They said, I would absolutely engage in additional workforce training if it would improve, again, my standard of living and my job opportunities. But nearly a quarter of those said they had no idea how to go about doing it. They said, I just don't even know where to get access to that. So when we are working with economic development organizations, the most forward-thinking ones and the ones that are, we really feel are looking towards the long term and focused on success are those that are obviously doing talent attraction marketing, but also very, very focused on reskilling and upskilling. They're very dedicated in terms of not only demonstrating what a new job could offer in terms of salary and career benefits, but also how to get there. So basically, what are these very specific open positions in their community? Where can they go to get that training? How long does that training take? And they want to make sure that there's a very clear path laid out. So in order to address those quarter of the respondents that we heard that just said, I would love to do this, but I just don't know how to do it. So, it's those forward-thinking EDOs that I think have their eye on the long term and really, how can we play this long game and make sure that we're setting our community and our residents up for success.
So Marshall, I would just add, I'm a historian, and in addition to doing the various labor work, and history shows that time and time again, working people are constantly being sort of thrown out of work by technology, whether it's the person who used to make shoes by hand and then it became done on the assembly line. Whether it's the secretaries who used to type on typewriters and now everybody uses their computers, right? It's constantly that technology is changing the workforce, is changing jobs. The key question to me isn't the future of work so much as it's the future of workers, right? So to what extent can we use policy? Can we use law? Can we ask the question, what does it take for working people to be able to maintain security, to be able to maintain communities, right? And what policies do we need to undergird workers in order to make that transition? Because it is not a natural process that just happens, right? It is determined by the laws, the policies that we make. And we are perfectly capable of having wonderful technological changes that improve our lives, that mean an end to sweatshops, that mean an end to drudgery, and which allow us to perhaps work fewer hours in the week. We can do that. But if we do it on the terms of the winner take all that we've been living under for the past 40 years, then we're going to basically end up undermining the entire system and our communities for everyone.
But maybe if we take what Lane is talking about, let's say $15 an hour minimum wage, PRO Act, is there a negative side to that from a labor market point of view? If let's say the cost to employers become too high, is that a potential problem? So I understand what Lane is advocating, but the question is there a downside to that? Michael, maybe you might have thought a bit about that.
Well, I think Lane is right that it's a wage shortage, much more than a skill shortage. Joel, I hear these people talk about skill shortage all the time. Yeah, there's some upskilling that needs to be done and so forth, but it's if you look at the jobs that we're going to need, even aside, Marshall, from the AI, but the job projections that BLS has done, and it's really been pretty consistent for the past 20 years. Their home health aides, their retail clerks, their jobs that lower wage jobs. So I think it's a wage shortage. That's what we really need to focus on. Unfortunately, as you know, Joel, it's crazy here in California. Rather than focus on work, the whole discussion now is on guaranteed income. That's the way to solve AI, and that's the way to solve our job loss. It's not to ask the question, how do we keep people working? It's how do we give people more benefits? People should be, during the pandemic, it's unbelievable. The focus of our state government is people should be happy with their unemployment insurance. They shouldn't worry about working, So I think we're going in the wrong direction.
It's interesting, Michael, that you would talk about the BLS and EDD projections for what kinds of jobs are going to be required. What I find interesting is that most of the new jobs, other than the new creation of knowledge work, right, of algorithms and STEM kinds of things, are all what I would call last mile service jobs, where the implementation of a company's strategy is dependent upon this particular class of workers who is delivering the service.
Right.
And what I find fascinating about that is that so many management teams look at that as a commodity, as opposed to an opportunity to differentiate themselves in the marketplace. One would think that it would be great to invest in teaching talent how to deliver in a differentiated way, rather than saying, okay, how cheap can I get away with this thing being delivered? Because what this pandemic has shown us is that there is pricing power. The worry that everybody had about, hey, are we, I'm going to get these, I'm going to have to pay more for labor and I'm not going to be able to charge more in my restaurant, is breaking down. In fact, people are charging more to be able to make up for those costs. So, excuse me. So I'm intrigued to get your thought about that, to see whether or not this last mile labor is actually an opportunity for businesses to succeed as opposed to an imposed cost.
Well, I'll be interested in what Lane or Robyn think. I will tell you my experience, Marshall. So for 20 years ago, we had the same view. Could we raise the wages of farm workers here in California by doing certain training, what we called then career ladders, still called career ladders, skills upgrading. And by doing the skills upgrading, could we raise the wages? And we tried it for farm workers. We had a number of programs. We tried it for certified nurse assistants. These are the people who provide direct services in long-term care facilities. They get paid nothing. So we said, are there ways to improve the services, their skills, a skill approach and get them to be paid more. And so we tried it there. We tried it with a couple of the labor unions in hospitality. So it was across sectors, wasn't it? None of them succeeded. Not one. There is the wages of farm workers. The ag people said basically, we can't pay anymore and be competitive with Chilean oranges or whatever it was. The people in the long-term care facilities said, we can't pay anymore. That's all we can pay. We want to stay in business. And the same thing with hospitality. So it's an interesting idea. I am a big believer in craftsmanship and trying to look at these low-wage jobs as crafts where there's real skill. There's no reason to keep, trying to have people move up from CNAs. What's more important than being a CNA? But, better to have someone do a CNA job really well. We all benefit. But at least my experience, maybe Lane and Robyn's are different, when we've actually tried to improve the skills and differentiate and not make it a commodity, it hasn't succeeded at all.
Has that been true in the industrial sphere? Because I see in Ohio and other states where they have training programs, some people have seen significant increases in their income through training, but maybe it's harder in an industry which is not a traded goods sector.
Well, and if you have direct substitutions from low-cost labor countries, that's going to be very difficult to do it. But in the service area, like long-term care, for instance, where, by the way, the people who own long-term care facilities are making plenty of money. They're not scratching out a living. And so there probably is some headroom in their P&Ls to be able to and we're seeing old people like Joel, who is far closer to being put into an old age home than I am, probably be willing to pay a premium for that. If the services delivered are going to be higher quality. But Lane and Robyn, what's your sense of that? Lane?
Do you want to jump in, Robyn, and then I'll go?
Oh, no, you go ahead, please.
I mean, I think that, it's interesting that we are talking about CNAs, because it brings to mind to me the role that so many essential workers played during the pandemic. There was an amazing recognition of the work that average working people are doing during the pandemic. We banged our pots and pans for nurses, for health aides. We cheered on the UPS driver, driving down the street. We said thank you to the clerks who were at the grocery store. There was a recognition that these folks are putting their health and their lives on the line, and that they are certainly willing and ready, and in my experience are happy to learn new skills, right, when the employers offer them. Too often, however, employers do not. Employers are competing on wages and are constantly, because they are finding it harder to compete on globalization issues or technology, they compete on wages. And so we, again, need to have policies and laws in this country which shake up that equation. And I'm going to put out just a few ideas, right? In this country, as opposed to in other countries, we demand a lot of our employers. We say, employers, you're gonna provide healthcare, right? Or we don't require it, but that's the system that we've had, where people get employer-provided healthcare. We turned to that system after World War II. We, people's most robust pensions come through the employers. We have such a low minimum wage that even sort of base wages in this country come through the employers. We are leaning on employers to provide a basic social welfare state in this country. We've been doing it for 40 years. That was the model we adopted after World War II. In order to shake things up and get employers out of this paradigm where they're constantly competing on wages, I think having some of these other elements of our social welfare state off of employers' backs and addressing them through the state, through government policy, would really shake up our paradigm and actually make us probably more competitive with other nations. That's a different way of doing things. But you know, for too long in this country, we have continued to say it's education and skills. We've just got to get people educated, just got to get those skills. But in fact, you know, there's limits to that if we don't fundamentally think about why employers are competing on wages and driving down wages.
Well, that should be a good way for you, Michael and Robyn, make your comments as we move towards wrapping up. I think this is a fascinating proposal because I can tell you I get to see a little bit because my wife's Canadian, and so we look at what, now that my youngest daughter has now also become a Canadian citizen, you know, the fact that healthcare is not a concern and education really, you know, that's why I want my daughter to go to the University of British Columbia and not to someplace on the East Coast that will bankrupt us. So is this a direction that might give us some of the solutions? Michael, Robyn, your final thoughts on this?
Robyn, do you understand?
Michael?
You know, yeah, Michael, you go ahead.
Well, I mean, you know, Joel, you and I are sort of, I think, economic populists.
Right.
We disagree with the liberal consensus, the liberal establishment. And I think the pandemic, if anything, has shown the limitations of, you know, the liberal establishment. We'll see what, you know, what direction Bidenomics takes. But I do think, you know, again, I come back to these key issues. I think the wage shortage, the low wage jobs. Obviously, here in California, our small business community has been decimated. And small business openings as of last week are still down over 50% since the start of the pandemic. So, yeah, expanding the social welfare state is, you know, it is one element perhaps, but I also come back finally to a job strategy.
Right.
So much of our focus in California now is on benefits, and people should be happy with their unemployment insurance and on guaranteed income now. Joel, you see last week, now that the state government is now funding guaranteed income pilots. Now, those may have a role, but I think as we begin to decouple income from work and move away from a job strategy, it's always been, job strategy used to be the union strategy, Lane, as you know, from the 70s and 80s. It was a job strategy. You know, we had the Humphrey Hawkins Act that it was jobs. Well, we moved away from that. And so, yes, social welfare benefits are important, but I think as we move away from the job strategy and a focus on connecting people to employment and the structure of employment, and not reducing that in hours, Lane, you and I may disagree, but you know, how we do that, I think that's our challenge going forward.
Robyn?
Yeah. So, you know, I think so at the beginning of this year, we polled a number of economic development organizations across the country. And what we heard from them, and we specifically asked, you know, what's keeping you awake at night? You know, what are the issues that are most concerning to you? And it was so interesting because there was such a drastic shift in terms of, you know, previously it was all about business attraction. And when we think about, you know, we talked a lot about how policies need to change. And, you know, what we heard from them was precisely that. They were focused on such different topics in terms of educating their employers, you know, focusing on those small businesses. I mean, they know that their small businesses were decimated during COVID. And so now, you know, all of their focus was, you know, shifting towards, you know, how can they support their local small businesses? How can they, again, support that underlying infrastructure that's so critical for working individuals in terms, again, of childcare and housing, affordable housing. And you know, so it was really interesting and encouraging to see that shift, that they were sort of broadening their thinking in terms of what actually needed to be done, again, to connect employers with employees and make sure that, again, that they were kind of rising that tide for all of their residents, and while at the same time supporting, not only their business attraction efforts, but also, their.
Well, Robyn, Lane, and Michael, thank you so much. Just thinking through what it is that you've said over this past 40 minutes or so, it's clear that we may be entering a new world, a new labor management relationship, and maybe not. Maybe it'll just circle back around to the old normal. Be fascinating to see how it all plays out, but thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Take care.